This video will focus on the social and political history of the Soviet Union in the 1930s. A quick note, much of this video is borrowed from the book A History of Western Society, published by the Houghton Mifflin Company. Last class we focused on Stalin's attempt to remake agriculture and industry. But communism had more ambitious goals than just industry. They sought to create a new and improved type of person. Devout communists assumed that once the state consolidated ownership of all property, that a new human would emerge, less consumed by the desire to accumulate wealth and therefore less self-centered. Okay, as we talk about the reality of Stalinist Russia, I thought it would be interesting to juxtapose my narrative with a Soviet propaganda film from 1937. The film that you're going to see demonizes Western capitalists and also praises the advances of the five-year plan. The average Russian lived off of black bread and wore old shabby clothes. It's hard for us to imagine the shortage of food, the shortage of consumer goods, and the shortage of housing. With millions of peasants flocking to new cities for work and factories, the Soviet government failed to keep up with the demand for new apartments. And now try to imagine what that would be like. Imagine that your entire immediate family, your siblings and your parents, all lived in a single room. And then also imagine sharing a single bathroom, a kitchen with several other families. This means that you would be lucky in Soviet Russia in the early 1930s. Despite the discomfort of everyday life, however, we should keep in mind that many Russians did have quite a lot of idealism. There was a genuine excitement for the Soviet experiment, and there was an assumption that Russia was leading the world into a new phase of human history, attempting to create the first socialist society. The fact that the Great Depression during the 1930s nearly destroyed capitalism in Britain, Germany, and the United States also supported this worldview, and even Westerners became persuaded to join local communist parties. So again, despite the deprivations of everyday life, there was some enthusiasm and some hope. And there were genuine pros to life in the Soviet Union. For the first time in Russia, there was free public education, free daycare for working moms, and free medical services. There was also pensions for the elderly. There was opportunity for personal advancement. The sons and daughters of peasants and workers could advance to high levels of management. And this is in large part due to this five-year plan's desperate need for skilled technicians, engineers, and factory managers. Stalin placed an emphasis on creating technical schools where the young could be trained. If you managed to work your way up in a factory hierarchy, you received special privileges like better food, better housing, maybe a car. You even received extra money. One could argue that the lives of women improved under Soviet Russia. Immediately after the October Revolution, Lenin declared women to be legally equal to men. He did this several years before women won the right to vote in the United States. Prior to the revolution, women were considered the property of their husbands. They had little defense against rape and no legal right to divorce abusive husbands. That changed under the communists. The communists provided free abortion clinics, equal access to education, and established the right of women to divorce their husbands. Women entered the workforce in the millions during the five-year plan. Now, granted, a lot of this was to fill menial labor, but women also started to dominate the medical profession. By 1950, for instance, 75% of all Soviet doctors were women. But to really understand life in the Soviet Union, we must understand the constant barrage of communist propaganda, and this is what we're watching right now. The communists attempted to control every aspect of art, music, and entertainment, and they used these mediums to their own ends. Party activists were assigned to factories and collective farms, and they gave periodic and mandatory lectures on the virtues of communism. Imagine going to work every day and then having to break for an hour to listen to a lecture about how great your government is. Newspaper, radio, and film told stories about the successes of the five-year plan and about capitalist plots to destroy the Soviet Union. Churches were converted into museums of atheism, and above all, Stalin's image was everywhere. There were portraits in almost every home, every office and school, statues in every major city, and posters of Stalin along every major street. Okay, we're gonna skip the rest of this clip. Okay, we have to talk about terror in order to really understand Soviet Russia. And this aspect of life in the Soviet Union may be the most difficult thing for us to grasp. Terror was Lenin's official policy during the Civil War from 1918 to 1922. And terror was again used by the Red Army against the peasantry during collectivization in the late 1920s and early 1930s. In the mid-1930s, however, terror took on a new role. It was used against members of the Communist Party, even some of Stalin's most loyal allies. This period was known as the Great Purge. The Great Purge began in 1934, just as opposition began to mount within the Communist Party against the five-year plans. One of Stalin's closest allies, Sergei Kirov, began to consolidate a following amongst the communists. This following potentially threatened Stalin's primacy over the Soviet Union. One night in November 1934, Kirov was found murdered, and this was most likely done by NKVD agents. Stalin used Kirov's murder as a pretext or an excuse to arrest, torture, and eventually execute 16 of the highest-ranking communists. This was known as the infamous public show trials. He claimed that these communists were part of a vast conspiracy to sabotage the Soviet Union. And this was a remarkable claim because many of these men who were executed were some of Lenin's closest advisors and allies, men who were dedicated to the October Revolution. They were even close allies of Stalin's. Gregory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, for instance, helped orchestrate the isolation of Trotsky and pave the way for Stalin's rise. To show his thanks, Stalin ordered their execution. The Great Purge did not stop with the high-level communist officials. In 1937, there was a wave of NKVD arrests of local Communist Party members, men who were relatively insignificant, also men and women who didn't hold power at all. Then the purge expanded to intellectuals, to army officers, to factory managers, and ordinary citizens suspected of disloyalty. By 1939, 8 million had been arrested, and of these, millions were either executed or died working in the gulags. Stalin, of course, took the opportunity to replace the purged communists with 1.5 million young men and women fanatically loyal to him personally. The book, A History of Western Society, does a great job reflecting on this period of Soviet history. Okay, while I read a quote from the book, it might be interesting to watch Stalin give a speech. And this is typical of Stalin's style. It's very understated, and he's not even going to say much. He's just listening to the crowd clap at his every movement. Okay, this is the quote. Stalin's mass purges remain baffling, for almost all historians believe that those purged posed no threat and confessed to crimes they had not committed. Certainly, the highly publicized purges sent a warning to the people. No one was secure. Everyone had to serve the party and its leader with redoubled devotion. Some Western scholars have also argued that the terror reflected a fully developed totalitarian state, which must always be fighting real or imaginary enemies. The long-standing Western interpretation that puts the blame for the Great Purges on Stalin, which became very popular in Russia after the fall of communism, has nevertheless been challenged. Some historians argue that Stalin's fears were exaggerated but real. Moreover, these fears and suspicions were shared by many in the party and in the general population. Bombarded with ideology and political slogans, the population responded energetically to Stalin's directives. Investigations and trials snowballed into mass hysteria, a new witch hunt that claimed millions of victims. In short, in this view of the 1930s, a deluded Stalin found large numbers of willing collaborators for crimes as well as for achievement.